social Darwinism, racial theory and fascism. 1b In of racial theory in the 18th century, biologism in philosophy and sociology has always been a basis for reactionary philosophical tendencies. Of course, this has nothing to do with biology as a science. It stemmed rather from the conditions of the class struggle, which made pseudo-biological concepts and methods a suitable instrument of the reactionary battle against the idea of progress. During the course of history, such use of disfigured and distorted biological concepts in philosophy and sociology has occurred in either a naive or a sophisticated form, depending on circumstances. However, the application of the analogy of the organism to society and the state has always tended, and not by accident, to prove the natural principle behind any given social structure. This tendency is already clearly apparent in the old, anecdotal form of the fable of Menenius Agrippa. In the reactionary struggle against the French Revolution, the comparison with the organism acquired a fresh nuance, as early as Burke, in that it referred not only to a static condition, but also to dynamic development. Only organic growth, that is to say change through small and gradual reforms with the consent of the ruling class, was regarded as a natural principle, whereas every revolutionary upheaval received the dismissive tag of contrary to nature. This view gained a particularly extensive form in the course of the development of reactionary German Romanticism, Savigny, the historical law school, etc. The antithesis of organic growth and mechanical fabrication was now elaborated. It constituted a defense of naturally grown, feudal privileges against the praxis of the French Revolution and the bourgeois ideologies underlying it, which were repudiated as mechanical, highbrow and abstract. This antithesis, which the French Revolution first heightened to an uncommon degree, goes a long way back in time. In accordance with its own class interests, the ideology of the rising bourgeois class was fighting for the equality of all men, that is, for their equal rights as bourgeois citizens in a formal legal context. It strongly criticized the existing feudal privileges, the feudal inequality of rank of the state's citizenry. Now, at the time that these struggles were intensified, the nobility's dominance was already undermined both economically and politically, so that it was losing its concrete medieval social functions and developing more and more into a purely parasitical body. And this produced an inevitable need to defend privileges ideologically. It was out of these struggles that racial theory sprouted. The nobility's ideologists defended inequality of station with the argument that this was only the juristic expression of the natural inequality of the human species, the human races, and that as a fact of nature, it could not be invalidated through any kind of institutions without jeopardizing the highest values of mankind. As early as the start of the 18th century, Comte de Boulainvilliers wrote a book in which he tried to prove that in France, the nobility represented the descendants of the old Frankish ruling class, whereas the rest of the population were heirs of the subject Gauls. Therefore two qualitatively different races were confronting one another, and the only way to abolish the superiority of the Franks would be by destroying their civilization. 18th century writers already passionately contested this thesis. In 1734, for instance, Dubos declared that the Frankish conquest of France was a legend. These polemics became particularly trenchant at the time of the French Revolution. In his Ruins, Volney derided the nobility's claim to represent a superior and pure race. He ironically demonstrated how great a part of the existing nobility was made up of nouveau riches, former merchants, artisans, and so forth, who had purchased their titles with cash from the crown and who, therefore, were pure plebeians with regard to race. And the French bourgeoisie's leading ideologist in the early days of the Revolution, Seize, challenged in principle the founding of justice on the basis of conquests. The Third Estate, he said, needs only to transfer itself back to the year preceding the conquest, and because it is strong enough today not to succumb to the conquerors, its resistance will doubtless be more effective. Why should it not send back to the Frankish forests all these families who are foolishly claiming to be descended from the conquerors and to inherit their rights? 14.2. Gobineau's racial theory. Thus racial theory in its first rudimentary form was already scientifically discredited at the time of the French Revolution. But the class forces behind it did not disappear in the Revolution. The struggle against democracy continued and constantly took new forms. Thus racial theory was bound to flare up again in various forms. Its further vicissitudes were determined by the class struggles, partly by the varying amount of influence which feudal or semi-feudal reaction gained in the crisis-beset development of bourgeois democracy, and partly by the ideological needs of a reactionary bourgeoisie turned anti-democratic. For the latter looked to the remnants of the feudal age for political support, and in this connection appropriated elements of its ideology. Thus there came about, especially in Germany, the various organic theories we have mentioned in the first half of the 19th century. However, racial theory remained without notable influence ideologically. Its representatives during that period are completely forgotten nowadays. It was the fascist scholars who gradually brought these ancestors to light. In 1855, for example, a Magdeburg professor called Karl Waldorf published a work on racial theory which it would be hard to trace in even the largest reference books today. The reason is that in Germany, the development of reaction after the crushing of the 1848 revolution occurred in forms which did not, as yet, create any need for a racialist substantiation of noble privileges. Bismarck's Bonapartist compromise guaranteed the Prussian Junkers their politically dominant position in Germany on terms which favored the development of capitalism without creating a bourgeois democracy. Thus the feudal Junkers were not threatened in a way necessitating any such invocation of their racial superiority, but at about the same time as the aforementioned work, there appeared a book which, gradually threw the racial idea into prominence on a universal scale. Gobineau's The Inequality of the Human Races. This book too was written during the reactionary period, that of Napoleon 111, but the circumstances of its origin are markedly different from parallel phenomena in Germany. Here, the Junkers had undisputed possession of the political positions of power, and the capitalization of Germany could only be effected in a way that preserved their interests. In the Second Empire, on the other hand, the reactionaries disappointed those legitimist feudal circles in France which, as part of the Party of Order, had enabled Louis Napoleon to come to power in the times of revolutionary crisis. The better minds among them had also learned from the revolution a thing or two about the contradictions of bourgeois democracy. Hence the possibility of a fresh advance by feudal racial ideology, whose most influential spokesman in the long run was the aforesaid Gobineau. Granted, in France even his influence was slight at first. In his letters to Tocqueville, he complained that his book was being hushed up in France and was having a real effect only in the United States. Tocqueville, who rejected the book in spite of his friendship with Gobineau, pointed out to him that this was because the book chimed with the slave owners' interests in the southern states at all events. This first major instance of the influence of modern racial theory is significant on a socio-historical plane. Gobineau himself had proceeded from feudal aristocratic class interests and considerations. Nonetheless, he had to live and proclaim his ideas in a society where the nobility's desire to return to its old hereditary ranks had long since sunk to a reactionary utopia, while the bourgeoisie's defensive struggle against the rising proletariat had shifted to the center of events. And precisely the great planters in the southern United States were, despite the slave-holding form of their exploitation, capitalists, producers of the basic raw materials of the capitalist economy of the time. Thus, under the conditions of the 19th/20th century, an effective renewal of racial theory could only be achieved if it became a battle ideology of the reactionary bourgeoisie. As we have seen, philosophical irrationalism in general, from Schelling via Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, etc., followed the road of such an embourgeoisement. Racial theory from Gobineau to Rosenberg had also to go through this process. Gobineau's starting point and principal bias was the struggle against democracy, against the unscientific and unnatural idea of the equality of men. Tocqueville promptly criticized this after a single reading, pointing out that according to Gobineau, everything evil in history derived from this idea of equality. The book, said Tocqueville, was reactionary and had arisen out of a general mood of revolution weariness. Its effect was fatalistic. It was opium handed to a sick patient. Indeed, Tocqueville took the opportunity to prove particularly hurt Gobineau that his racial theory was irreconcilable with Christianity and with Catholicism. In these observations, the celebrated liberal moderate historian Tocqueville correctly showed Gobineau's specific characteristics in terms of politics and worldview. It is already evident from these observations that Gobineau was a transitional figure in the history of racial theory. On the one hand, he gave to old feudal reactionary talk of the natural inequality of man a new, seasonable, that is, semi-bourgeois form. On the other hand, it was not yet possible for him to complete this modernization, this bourgeois version of racial theory, in a really radical way. He struck the pose of a natural scientist and imitated the latter's sublime impartiality, but this quickly revealed its counter-revolutionary aspect. Thus Gobineau wrote, "In the side of this, natural scientific observation, GL, the rebel will be nothing but an impatient, ambitious malefactor, Timoleon only an assassin, Robespierre a ruthless criminal." 17 And this dichotomy of an arrogated natural scientific objectivity and feudal reactionary propaganda is manifest in Gobineau's entire oeuvre. He was an embattled reactionary, and his racial theory an anti-democratic battle theory. So for him, the acceptance of the equality of men was only a symptom of bastardization, of racial impurity. In normal times, he asserted, inequality was accepted as axiomatic. The majority of the citizens of a state, once that mixed blood is flowing in their veins, feel prompted by their large numbers to proclaim as a generally valid truth something which only holds good for themselves, that all men are equal. 18 He was, however, unable to make this combative line concrete and to indicate appropriate objectives or even methods to his supporters. He offered only the fatalistic perspective of an inevitable demise of culture as a result of racial mingling. The original white race has disappeared from the face of the earth. Thus, today, the white race is represented only through bastards. Once this mingling process is completed, there will come about a decline into insignificance. From that point the peoples, weighed down like human cattle in a gloomy stupor, will live ossified in their inconsequence, like the ruminating oxen in the stagnant pools of the Pontine marshes. It is not death that awakens our sorrow, but the certainty that it reaches us only stripped of dignity. It is chiefly this fatalistic pessimism that distinguishes Gobineau from his important successors, Chamberlain, Hitler and Rosenberg. With these, racial theory was to a mounting degree the organ of an actively militant reactionary demagogy. And this demagogy, 110. Likewise, increasingly cast off the old feudal confines of reaction to become an obscurantist ideology of reactionary monopoly capitalism. Here, of course, we must not forget that Gobineau's successors preserved elements of his racialist pessimism in a specific sense, namely in the view that development always means deterioration. Racial mixture is necessarily a corruption of the species. Thus the activism of later racial theory sprang from the same pessimistic, anti-evolutionary basis as with Gobineau. The only difference was that desperate, ambitious activism supplanted fatalistic despair. This change brought to the fore two elements absent from Gobineau. One was the social demagogy of a purportedly rebellious anti-capitalism as a basis for action, for although Gobineau too nursed a profound antipathy against purely capitalist culture and its ideology, this remained feudal in substance and aesthetic fatalistic in content. Secondly, parallel with this change, the later theorists divorced themselves from Christian feudal reactionary ideology and made extensive concessions again, of a demagogic kind, to the growing departure of broad masses from religion. We shall see presently that on this point, as on many others, Chamberlain formed the bridge between Gobineau and Rosenberg. These differences were dictated not by personal but by historical factors. Modern social demagogy did not spring up until the imperial epoch. Its first primitive and transitory forms were Stalker's anti-Semitism in Germany and Boulongism in France. In Austria it appeared in an already more advanced form in Luger's Christian social anti-Semitic propaganda, which directly influenced Hitler in his youth. After the First World War it was never off the agenda. The Hitler movement was only its most advanced, unscrupulous and successful variety but, in addition, a quite different exacerbation of the class conflicts from that of Gobineau's time was necessary. The broad masses needed to be much more profoundly disturbed by the contradictions of bourgeois democracy and disappointed with the paths to which bourgeois democracy and reformism in the labor movement were pointing, etc. The social demagogy of racial theory, which was in essence aristocratic reactionary and anti-democratic, now no longer made direct reference back to the feudal past as an ideal condition worthy of restoration, but masqueraded as a doctrine pointing to the future under Napoleon 111. The feudal aristocratic opposition was still, to a large extent, overtly feudal, its face turned towards the past. And the laboring masses disappointed with the Bonapartist regime, as far as they could recover from the blow of 1848 and shake off the influence of the Decembrists, demagogy evolved more and more strongly towards the left, in the direction of the regaining of democracy, and indeed of the socialist struggle. It was from this situation that Gobineau derived his peculiar features, especially his fatalistic pessimism. When the prospect of democratic development was radically denied and there was a convulsive clinging to an ineradicable past feudal inequality, such a fatalistic mood of doom could be the only result, so the following elements determine Gobineau's position in the development of racial theory. He was the first author for a long time to reintroduce the racial idea to broad circles and to bring it back into fashion among at least the decadent intelligentsia. He moreover expanded the arbitrary method that later, via Chamberlain, became an operative factor with Hitler and Rosenberg. This was a mixture of purportedly natural scientific exactness and high-flown mysticism, intended to make the old feudal racial theory acceptable and palatable to modern readers in an atmosphere of perfect arbitrariness and a tangle of unresolved, insoluble contradictions. The ancient racial theory was extremely simple. Indeed, we can hardly call it a theory at all. It proceeded from the thesis that everyone could tell an aristocrat. For, as an aristocrat, he was of pure stock and descended from the superior race. The Franks in contrast to the plebeian Celts of Gaul. Modernized racial theory, in the face of scientific developments, could no longer hold this simple position. It had to start with a tactical withdrawal. It is, after all, a generally acknowledged fact of modern science that a single pure race has never existed, at least not in historical times. Secondly, it is also generally known and recognized that there are, similarly, objective distinguishing features for the various races only to a very limited extent. And these general criteria fall down completely when it comes to the racial definition of a historical people, nation or even individual that would suffice to destroy racial theory as an explanatory method of history. Gobineau's achievement in the development of reactionary ideology lay in the fact that he opened the doors to that revival of racial theory which was later to culminate in Hitler. With regard to the first complex of ideas, the theory of racial purity, Gobineau was plainly a transitional figure. Using some pseudo-scientific phraseology which was always entirely abstract, he chose the path of purely intuitive, irrationalist, historical myth. That is to say, he proceeded to spin fantasies and built a new world history on a so-called racial foundation. He did this wholly naively, basing his case on the feudal aristocratic tradition, and treated races, miscegenation, etc., as something perfectly well known that required no further elucidation and analysis. In these tendencies he was rubbing shoulders with many similarly pseudo-scientific French sociologists of his time, who also spoke of race as though the content and scope of this concept were things scientifically definite and definable. None of his colleagues, to be sure, gave racial theory this exclusive central place in their methodology. With Taine, Renan and others, their equally vague and unscientific racial concept was only one explanatory reason among many. Gobineau's pseudo-scientific and at the same time intuitionist apodicticity formed no small element of his influence. Although also of its limitation, the conscious, militant later racial theorists who paved the way for fascism also looked on this obviously unscientific approach as blameworthy in Gobineau. Thus Chamberlain, who tacitly appropriated a good deal from him in other respects, vehemently dismissed his work with the accusation that he had no inkling of natural science. Chamberlain wrote, "A theory of race that is useful and can be taken seriously cannot be constructed on the tale of Sem, Cam and Japhet and such ingenious intuitions, mixed with hair-raising hypotheses, but only on a thorough and comprehensive knowledge of natural science expresses the antithesis that, whereas Gobineau as an Orthodox Catholic believer took great trouble to harmonize his racialist view of history with the Old Testament, Chamberlain already repudiated the latter as Jewish trumpery. 111 This criticism also. Gobineau had to postulate the question of racial purity nevertheless. Purity of race was, in his view, an ideal condition and never fully realized. He stated, "It would be false to assert that all miscegenation is a bad thing. If the three major basic types had remained strictly apart and formed no mutual links, then the upper hand would doubtless always have remained with the finest branches of the white race, and the black and yellow skin types would have been subject to the meanest nations of this race for all eternity. This would have been a kind of ideal condition which history has never offered. We can only gain some idea of it if we consider the indisputable superiority of those groups of our race which have remained the least adulterated. At all events, the human races have lived in a state of miscegenation since the dawn of history. Gobineau's historical mysticism sprang from this necessary concession to the scientific developments of his time. While he did not know what race was and could not define its characteristics, and knew that the peoples historically known to us have come about through miscegenation, he also knew in very precise detail when, how and to what degree instances of miscegenation were good or bad. It would serve no useful purpose to recount here the details of Gobineau's wild and senseless history fudging, not even so as to refute them. Let us give just one example to illustrate the speculativeness of his method. Gobineau advanced the claim that the origin of art was everywhere the result of a mingling with the black race. Granted, he described epic poetry as an achievement of the Aryan family of peoples. But, he added, even with this popular species, it evolved its fire and its full splendor only in those nations which did not remain free of miscegenation with black people. In arguing this thesis he went on to state, the Negro possesses a very high degree of that sensual disposition without which art is unthinkable. But his lack of intellectual talents, on the other hand, leaves him incapable of artistic refinement. If his natural propensities are to bear fruit, then he must enter into a union with a race whose talents are differently disposed. At 115 we see, therefore, that for Gobineau miscegenation, the union with races of lower standing, and he considered the Negro race the lowest, affected the fate of all culture. It was that bastardizing process which gave rise, in his view, to the aforementioned apocalyptic perspective of fateful universal doom. He also proclaimed, however, that so decisive a factor of culture as art could only derive from a mingling with the allegedly lowest race, the Negro race. So, on the one hand, we are told that the poor-blooded heroes of Homer or the Norse sagas rank far higher than present 114-day races which are mixed 100 times over, but, on the other hand, the Iliad and the Edda could only spring from miscegenation with Negroes. And of course Gobineau knew very precisely when, how, where and to what degree a given mixture would either produce the highest peaks of cultural attainment or condemn a culture to perdition. This one example may suffice to illustrate the crass contradictions and the arbitrariness of Gobineau's method. All the more because in order not to find himself at odds with Christianity, he had to accept the common origin of mankind, or rather he accepted it at times and left it open at others, and then again had recourse to the biblical trinity of Noah's sons, Sem, Cam, and Japhet. On the other hand, he built his whole theory untroubled by the fact that he was thereby entering into insoluble conflicts with the above supposition upon the dogmatic, qualitative physiological and psychological inequality of race. As propagator of this doctrinaire inequality he enthusiastically acclaimed the slaveholders of the southern United States, as we have already noted, and he also proclaimed, for instance, the incapacity for civilization, in principle, of the primitive Western Asian population. It could not become civilized because it lacked the necessary insight. It had to suffice to force its members into useful labor like animated machines. 115 Yet since Gobineau was aware that the Catholic Church laid claims to universality, he had to acknowledge that Christianity was within the reach of all men. This, however, was of no consequence to racial equality. Hence, in treating my question, one must keep Christianity completely apart again. Gobineau took the view, on the one hand, that Christianity was culture's supreme manifestation and that all men, irrespective of race, had the capacity to share in this cultural peak. On the other, he asserted also that all the lower races were uncivilizable in principle, that they were fit only to serve as slaves, living machines and beasts of burden for the higher races. On such points, Gobineau proves backward in relation to the modern proponents of racial theory, and he was in fact spurned by them. This antithesis expresses very clearly the totally barbaric character of modern racial theory. It becomes plain how the theory degraded all the findings of the evolution of thought in modern times to instruments of an unprecedented obscurantism which served imperialist ends. Whereas in the 18th and 19th centuries, the ideological struggle against Christianity was waged in the name of progress and freedom, the imperialist advocates of racial theory converted the religious critique into a tool of extreme reaction. The modern racial theorists passionately repudiated just that principle which constituted the historical progressiveness of Christianity, namely the recognition, however abstract, of the equality of all men, before God. Gobineau appeared backward in their eyes. 116. Because here he sought a compromise. A compromise in which Tocqueville, to be sure, rightly perceived hypocrisy. The later imperialist advocates of racial theory did in actual fact accomplish this break with Christianity. Despite this backwardness in Gobineau, his successors drew more from him than they were prepared to admit. Above all, he was the first to produce a really effective pseudo-scientific pamphlet contesting democracy and equality, on a racialist basis. Moreover, his book marked the first large-scale attempt to reconstruct the whole of world history with the aid of racial theory, and to do so by tracing back to racial questions historical crises, social conflicts and differences. With him, this was in effect tantamount to saying that every change to the social structure was unnatural and led to man's downfall, and therefore could not possibly be a step forward. About this ideal condition reigning at the outset, Gobineau wrote the following: It has been already established that every social order is founded upon three original classes, each of which represents a racial variety: the nobility, a more or less accurate reflection of the conquering race; the bourgeoisie, composed of mixed stock coming close to the chief race; and the common people, who live in servitude or at least in a very depressed position. These last belong to a lower race which came about in the South through miscegenation with Negroes, and in The North with Finns 117. The Aryans alone, he asserted, had realized this ideal form, which one could observe in the Indian castes and in European feudalism. The Semites had never raised themselves to the same height. This exclusively backward-looking tendency too was repudiated by later racial theorists. However, their so-called perspective of the future was only a revival of ancient barbaric conditions accomplished with all the atrocities of imperialism. Thus even in spite of their dismissive attitude, which was connected with the further development of reactionary tendencies in the imperialist epoch, the later racialists proceeded from the same basis, in many respects, as the founder of modern racial theory in founding the historical methodology of racial theory, Gobineau again created something which was preserved in later developments. The dogmatic insistence on the inequality of men necessarily implied a rejection of the concept of mankind, and with this there vanished one of the finest achievements of modern science, the idea of the uniform and regular development of men. Attacks on this had been occurring for a very long time. We know also that even without a racialist basis, it was possible to take apart the idea of mankind's uniform development, as Spengler did. But the significance of racial theory in the history of recent reactionary thought is that in it, all the important elements in this repudiation of world history were concentrated on attacking reason. The denial of a uniform history of man implied at the same time a denial of the equality of man, of progress and of reason. For Gobineau, there was only a history of the white race. This monstrous reactionary idea remained a staple of later racial theory. Gobineau stated, in the Oriental world, the unremitting struggle of racial forces was only enacted between the Aryan element on the one hand, and the black and yellow principle on the other. It is superfluous to mention that where only the black races were in contest or the yellow races were moving within their own circle, or even where mixtures of black and yellow-skinned peoples were at odds with each other, no history is possible. These struggles were essentially barren, like the ethnic motoric forces which prompted them. They did not create anything, and no memory of them has survived. History results only from the mutual contact of white races. 18. This view of history now yielded a unique theory of primitive history which was to remain a part of racial theory. For the racial theories, the differences in the stages of culture no longer signified phases of development that were completed successively by one and the same people, one and the same society. Instead, each stage was equated with specified races and placed in an eternal, metaphysical context. While specified races were permanently barbaric, others had never been savages or barbarians. Thus Gobineau thought of the transition from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age as a change of races. He wrote of the white race, it strikes us above all that the white race is never manifested in the same primitive state as the other two. From the first day, it proved relatively cultivated and possessed the essential seeds of a superior condition. This later developed in its separate branches and created the various forms of civilization. Gobineau asserted that from the start, the white races fought with their enemies on war chariots, and that they were able to fashion metal, wood and leather from the outset. The primal white races knew how to weave materials for their clothing. They lived in large villages which they decked out with pyramids, obelisks or mounds of earth or stones. They had broken-in horses. Their wealth consisted in numerous herds of bulls and cows. 119. Naturally Gobineau did not even raise the question of how such a culture originated. Evidently he thought that such an inquiry would already be a psychological sign of the bastard state. We can set this picture of the white race against Gobineau's aforestated observations on the uncivilizable primitive peoples of Western Asia, so we see that in Gobineau the destruction of historical science was already far advanced. His view reflects not only the feudal traditions of the European colonizers but also their racial arrogance towards the colored people whom they regarded as lacking a history, and uncivilizable. To be sure, as we have demonstrated, this interpretation of history logically indicated that the Aryans represented not only the climax but also the end of history. Fatalistic pessimism was inevitable for Gobineau. Several decades later, it won him a great popularity among the similarly pessimistic decadent intelligentsia of the turn of the century. And it made him redundant when the obscurantism of imperialist racial theory became militant and activist and proceeded to the crucial offensive against human culture. 3. Social Darwinism. Gumlowitz rates Zinhofer Woltmann. In order for racial theory to become the ruling ideology of extreme reaction, it had to shed its overtly feudal trappings and put on the costume and mask of the very latest scientific thinking. But this involved more than merely a change of dress. The latter was only a reflection of a change in the decisive class character of the new racial theory. Even in its most modern form, certainly, it was still a pseudo-biological defense of class privileges. But now the issue was no longer merely one of the historical nobility as was largely the case with Gobineau. It concerned, on the one hand, the privileges of the European races as opposed to the colored ones, as already with Gobineau, as also of the Germanic races, chiefly the German nation within the other European races, which made it an ideology of German global control. On the other hand, it concerned the claim to dominance of the capitalist class within each separate nation and thus the origin of a new nobility, not anymore the conservation of the historical feudal aristocracy. This change came about little by little. Almost half a century elapsed before the new racial theory found in Chamberlain a leading theoretician to match Gobineau's role in propounding the old theory. So-called social Darwinism played a decisive part in bridging these two stages of racial theory. Darwin's doctrine had an immense influence on the whole development of science and outlook in the second half of the 19th century. Progressive science was enormously enriched and stimulated by Darwin's works. Major scientific advances took place wherever genuine scientists and philosophers were engaged in absorbing and digesting the real substance of Darwin's oeuvre. Thus Engels wrote to Marx, incidentally, the Darwin I am just reading is quite a name. One side of teleology was still intact up to now, but not any longer. Moreover, never has there been a finer attempt to demonstrate historical development in nature, and certainly none so felicitous. 120 Marx wrote to Engels in similar terms. This book, although developed in the blunt English fashion, is the one that contains the natural historical basis for our view. 121 Darwin, however, attained to universal influence when the social sciences were undergoing a general crisis, and his influence ran into this crisis. On the whole, the reactionary bourgeois ideologists contested Darwinism, chiefly its consequences for philosophy and world outlook, but also its methodology and findings in the natural sciences. Above all, the struggle of reactionary bourgeois ideology was aimed against the theory of evolution, and thus against the very point in which Engels rightly saw the greatest advance which Darwin's work signified. So the basic line taken by the bourgeois sciences, bourgeois philosophy especially, was anti-Darwinist. That, however, did not prevent a Darwinism that had become a cliché from temporarily playing no mean role in the social sciences. Reviewing a book by F. A. Lang, Marx criticized very sharply this newly emerging tendency in the social sciences. Herr Lang has made a great discovery. All history is to be subsumed under a single great law of nature. This law of nature is the cliché, for as used here, the Darwinian term becomes a mere cliché. Struggle for life and its substance is the Malthusian law of population, or rather overpopulation. Thus, instead of analyzing the struggle for life as it presents itself historically in various specified forms of society, all one must do is to convert that concrete struggle into the catchphrase struggle for life, and the latter into the Malthusian population fantasy. You must admit that this is a very searching method as far as stuck-up, pseudo-scientific, high-flown ignorance and mental laziness are concerned. 22 Let us consider briefly the general preconditions for the emergence of so-called Darwinism in sociology. The classical economy had dissolved as a result of the class struggles, in England especially. Its transformation into a popular economy had repercussions which were not confined to economics in the narrower sense. It was not by accident that sociology became divorced from economics around this very time and thereby established itself as an independent discipline. With Kant the divorce was from St. Simon's utopianism, but that does not greatly affect the situation. Kant detached sociology from its economic basis just as Spencer, for instance, was later to do in England. And having renounced its methodologically necessary economic basis, the new sociology sought and found support for its purported objectivity and orderliness in the natural sciences. Of course, this substantiation of sociology through chemistry, biology, etc., could only be effected by coining abstract clichés from the findings of the natural sciences, as Marx showed above in the case of Lang and Darwin. Kant, Spencer and so-called organic sociology in Germany all operated in this way. It is patent that, given such an orientation in sociology, the world influence of Darwinian theory could not possibly pass it by without deeply affecting it. It goes without saying that there are profounder reasons for this influence than the mere methodological needs of bourgeois sociology. In the last quarter of the 19th century, bourgeois ideology entered a new phase of capitalist apologetics. Both the harmonist doctrine of popular economics and the theory of organic growth and quasi-biological sociology were proving inadequate, particularly with regard to the struggle against socialist ideas. They were proving ineffective among broad circles of that public to which bourgeois sociology was addressing itself. The reason for this failure of the harmonist war doctrine of popular economics and organic sociology lay in a heightening of the capitalist contradictions and, in association with it, an aggravation of the class struggles. Manifesting themselves with increasing vigor, these revealed more and more clearly the worthlessness of the harmonist doctrine. Now, if capitalism was to be justified as the best economic and social system conceivable, and if sociology was to lead to a reconciliation with the capitalist system and convince the undecided of its unsurpassable merit, as a bourgeois apologetic science was obliged to do, then the contradictions and above all the inhuman sides of capitalism could be excused and glossed over no longer. It was precisely with these that the apologia had to begin. In short, whereas capitalist apologetics had hitherto denied the bad aspects of this system, it was precisely thence that the new apologetic proceeded. It sought to persuade the bourgeois intelligentsia to approve these bad aspects, or at least to come to terms with them as supposedly unalterable, nature-given and perennial. Clearly, Darwinism in its hackneyed form offered an exceptionally suitable starting point for this new form of apologetics. We have noted also that at about the same time, Nietzsche was likewise exploiting stereotyped Darwinism in this direction. In view of this strong ideological need, it is no wonder that sociological schools sprang up to execute this new form of capitalist apologetics with its pseudo-Darwinian basis. This social Darwinism presented, moreover, the most manifold possibilities. Firstly, it engendered monistic, natural scientific view of sociology. Society was presented as a completely homogeneous part of the general cosmic order. Whereas Engels welcomed Darwinism because it required a historical interpretation of nature, this sociology used a hackneyed Darwinism in order to demolish historicism in the social sciences. Secondly, not only all economic categories but also classes disappeared from sociology. They were supplanted by the racial struggle for life. In the third place, oppression, inequality, exploitation and so forth were presented as facts of nature, or laws of nature, which, as such, could not be avoided or revoked. Thus all the frightful products of capitalism were justified as being in accordance with nature. Fourthly, a sociology based on natural laws led men to acquiesce in a capitalist destiny. Gumplowitz formulated this side of social Darwinism with great firmness. The last word in sociology was, for him, the interpretation of human history as a natural process. This interpretation was the summit of all human morality because it preaches most persuasively the self-sacrificial subordination of man to those laws of nature which alone govern history. And because it was the morality of rational 125 resignation finally, this doctrine presented itself as loftily objective and above party issues, though its main front was of course clearly opposed to socialism and its adherents. Thus Gumplowicz' pupil Ratzenhofer said of the various parties' attitude to sociology that men in privileged positions were hostile to it, but so too were the oppressed, because it has to deprive them of illusions about their chances of a complete fulfillment of 124 their desires. This social Darwinism was an international phenomenon far exceeding sociology in the narrower sense. Compare, for instance, Lombroso's theory of the born criminal. Granted, this direction never gained sole dominance in bourgeois sociology. The shrewder and better trained bourgeois sociologists soon saw through the emptiness and phrasemongering of this sensational new method. Discussions arose on an international scale. Social Darwinism was challenged not only by the representatives of old liberal thought, who tried to eliminate all violence at least from the ideology and the spirit of the Harmonist doctrine and fulminated against the social 25, for instance, Darwinists' Machiavellism. Novikov contested banditism both from above, Bismarck, and from below, Marx and the class struggle. In the latter respect he was in agreement with his Darwinist opponents, except that he attempted to refute Marxism by other methods, but sociologists who were promoting the imperialist period's ideological development from other sides also sharply rejected social Darwinism. Chief among these was Tönnies, who wrote, "No argument for or against free competition, for or against cartels and trusts, state concerns and monopolies, capitalism or socialism is hidden in the principles of the theory of descent as though this were a Christmas stocking we must neither fear nor hope. For something of importance as a result of applying it these efforts have a strong tinge of the ridiculous, as does any nigger dressing up with spurious arguments, and they characterize a low degree of scientific thinking." 126. Gumplowicz, the typical, trend-setting representative of social Darwinism in the German-speaking realm. He and, even more markedly, his pupil Ratzenhofer proceeded from the absolute identity of and lack of qualitative distinction between natural and social processes. Sociology was, according to Gumplowicz, the natural history of mankind. And he went on to elucidate this methodological starting point by saying that it was the task of natural science to explain the processes of history through the was 127 governance of unalterable natural laws made it plainly evident how this was to be understood. We shall quote just one or two statements illustrating his method. Viewed accordingly, the principal laws of chemistry must also be sociological laws. The relationship of the elements, the greater or lesser mutual affinity between them or their dislike of certain associations are phenomena which not merely resemble the passions in social life, love and hate, but are causally identical with them in all their tendencies, external manifestations. Gumplowicz and Ratzenhofer were the polar opposite of Gobineau. Sober specialist science in contrast to Gobineau's wild speculations, strictly natural scientific monism in contrast to orthodox Catholicism, etc., etc. But they cultivated a decisive common basic feature of the biological method, that of tracing social phenomena back to an apparent set of laws with a Ratzenhofer. 128. 8 of specious natural scientific analogies. Here we can see also a specific bias which later became fully evident in fascism, the apotheosis of conclusions reached purely on the basis of analogies which were often extremely superficial, trivial, irrelevant and which in no respect clinched the argument by means of this supposedly natural scientific method. Social Darwinism revoked history. Man, it claimed, had not changed in the course of history. Gumplowicz stated, just let us rid ourselves of the vain illusion that man, nowadays civilized man, is any different in his nature, urges and needs, his capabilities and intellectual characteristics than he was in his primal state. 129. Thus sociology in its Darwinist garb expelled from the observation of society not only all economics, but also all social elements. That was methodologically necessary. For if sociology is founded on biology or anthropology, then it cannot permit of any essential change, let alone progress. After all, the changes in men that have occurred in recorded history are not of biological kind, but social. Therefore the biological proposition implies that what it takes to be the essence is subject to no further change or development. This too helped significantly in paving the way for the fascist interpretation of history. Indeed Gumplowicz, with the aid of the similarly hackneyed law of the conservation of energy, presented this anti-historism as a cosmic law. He wrote, in the realm of society's natural process, as in all the rest of nature, the operative forces can never go astray, and while their sum may be converted into differently operating forces, it can never be diminished. It is possible that the sum of the social energies operative in the realm of mankind since the earliest times will never diminish once they manifested themselves in countless tribal wars and clan feuds, and with the development of the social process in individual areas, with the progress of social amalgamation and the growth of culture, these energies are not lost but are expended in different forms. The sum of mutual exploitations in each given social community will never, perhaps, be smaller, although it may at times be practiced in other forms. Thus numerically fewer wars are being fought in Europe nowadays than in earlier centuries, but the size and significance of the individual wars, for example, Franco-German, Russo-Turkish, Russo-Japanese, are a match for the numerous earlier wars. 30 From these purported laws it followed, for Gumplowicz, that the mass of organisms on the earth must always remain constant, and that this mass is predetermined through the cosmic conditions of our globe. If parts of it increase, then the others must go by the board. At this point, monist sociology successfully brought this 131 Pseudo-Darwinism to dry land in a cosmically expanded Malthusianism. The upshot of all this for social Darwinism was, firstly, that there was no universal human progress. At best there was progress within a specified cultural realm. Here Gumplowitz was anticipating Spengler's theory of culture cycles. He explained that progress was conceivable only within the development of a disjunct cultural realm, starting afresh and running 132 its course in each instance. There was, therefore, no unified history of mankind. As we can see, that repudiation of world history which had gained currency through Spengler and Chamberlain was deeply rooted in the ideological needs of the imperialist bourgeoisie and originated in outwardly very dissimilar, methodologically downright contrary systems. Gumplowitz maintained that we cannot have any idea of human development as a unified whole because we have no self-contained idea of the subject. 135 of such a whole. With Gumplowitz, as later with Spengler and advanced racial theory, the development within each cultural realm followed a circular pattern. Each nation arrives at its highest stage of culture, ripens towards the point of decay, and the downfall is occasioned by the first barbarians to come along. 34. It is not hard to discern that here again, we are dealing with the shaky hypothesis of analogies. Gumplowitz, like Spengler after him, was simply applying the biological phases of individual life, youth, maturity, old age, by analogy to the cultural realms, or culture cycles. We see here the sharp contrast between the progressive and reactionary effects of Darwinism. Whereas Darwin's discoveries helped Marx and Engels to grasp nature and society as a great unified historical process, social Darwinism dissolved philosophically that conception of a unified world history of mankind attained by progressive bourgeois thought. This fundamentally incorrect mystical method toying with analogies behind a modest mask, led to totally false conclusions even where the original starting point lay in social observations which were not contrary to the facts. Thus Gumplowitz perceived that the origin of the state was very closely connected with the social inequality of men. But since he sought to explain this inequality not through economic but pseudo-scientific cosmic causes, correct observation gave rise to a reactionary mysticism. This engendered the close affinity of social Darwinism with the most reactionary theory in that for Gumplowitz as for Gobineau, the original inequality of men formed the point of departure. Ratzenhofer stated with the same firmness as Gobineau and later racial theory, inequality is the natural condition, equality is unnatural and impossible. 135. As in Gobineau's case, this pseudo-scientific mysticizing of economic facts had its basis in a general anti-democratic tendency. The great difference was that, whereas Gobineau revived the old, feudal aristocratic anti-democratism, social Darwinism expressed that of the bourgeoisie and a now victorious capitalism. Understandably, it did so most strongly in countries like Germany and Austro-Hungary where no triumphant bourgeois revolution preceded this economic dominance. So Gumplowitz examined the fate of the doctrines of equality in history, and, like later racial theory, he characteristically interpreted Judaism, Mohammedanism, the Christian Church and the French Revolution as completely equal tendencies. He now established that these tendencies were doomed to failure, and for the simple reason that these doctrines run counter to man's nature, so that their sway is at best only nominal. What in point of fact and perennially rules supreme in the world is a quite different set of teachings and precepts better suited to the rudimentary nature of the masses. It is not Buddhist teachings. The words of Christ or the principles of the French Revolution that reverberate in the din of embattled nations. In that din resound the cries of, here Aryan, here Semite, here Mongol, here European, here Asian, here white, here colored, here Christian, here Muslim, here German, here Roman, here slave, and so on in 1,001 variations. And among battle cries of this sort history is made, and human blood is spilled wholesale with a view to the fulfillment of a world historical law of nature which we are still a long way from discerning. 36. Gumplowitz was, as we can see, still far from eagerly affirming this natural process. As we have noted, he advocated a response of rational resignation, but with his primitive biologist view of history, his mysticizing of the facts of class struggle into a racial struggle ordained by nature, and the anti-democratic attitude permeating this whole conception, he was paving the way for the fascist view of history. Hence it was no accident that, with some reservations, he repeatedly lavished praise on distinct reactionaries who put forward such a concept, like Haller, Lombroso and Gobineau. His pupil Ratzenhofer voiced this anti-democratic attitude more pungently. The slogans of freedom, equality and international brotherhood are lying phantoms. The idea of sudden revolution is unhistorical. 137. In the light of these hypotheses, it is easy to understand why the state formed the center of sociology with Gumplowitz and his school. The state, on the basis of the natural inequality of man, was the demiurge of the division of labor in society. This view was leveled chiefly against working-class aspirations. Its aim was to demonstrate that the state, as an ordering of inequality, was the sole possible 138 order for men. With these theories Gumplowitz not only completely divorced sociology from economics but sought to restrict the latter which, course, he only knew in its contemporary vulgar form to a specific specialist discipline in contrast to sociology, which was universal. In this tendency to belittle economics, social Darwinism was likewise anticipating imperialist reactionary ideology. According to Gumplowitz, economics could make no claim whatever to comprehend society. It was just concerned with economic phenomena. But, he went on, the essence and life of a society is by no means fully spent in its economic activity, just as the individual is not fully occupied by it. Indeed, it is far rather the case that sociology might advance the claim to consider political economy as one of its parts. This reversal of the relation between politics and economics was connected with a central issue in 139 social Darwinism, namely the endeavor to grasp biologically, and thus do away with, every social distinction, class stratification and class struggle. Here deep-seated conflict arose in Gumplowitz himself, who was subjectively honest as a scholar. It is of wider interest because it reflects the intellectual and methodological confusion of this transitional stage and also shows how helpless this German-speaking intelligentsia was with regard to mainstream reactionary development. The hypotheses we have outlined necessarily entailed substituting race for class in sociology, particularly since physical force was regarded as the primary element in the state's development, so that class stratification was presented as the dominance of one race over another. And in his first, widely noted book Race and State, Gumplowitz did in fact formulate the problem such that he simply identified races with classes. But in the course of his subsequent work, he came to see more and more clearly the untenability of this postulate. He admitted as much in his second important work, The Racial Struggle 1883. In it he wrote of the racial issue, here everything is arbitrary, subjective appearance and opinion, scheinen und meinen. Nowhere is there firm ground or a firm piece of evidence, nor is there a positive result anywhere, and since, as a scientific monist, he was seeking at least a minimum of objective characteristics of racial differences, he arrived at the following conclusions: the sorry role played by all anthropological measuring of skulls and the like can be appreciated by anyone who has ever tried to gain enlightenment through these studies of mankind's different types. Everything is higgledy-piggledy, and the mean figures and measurements offer no palpable result. What one anthropologist describes as the Germanic type, another deems opposite to the slave type. We find Mongolian types among Aryans, and we constantly land in the position of taking Aryans for Semites and vice versa if we abide by anthropological categories. 40 Even Ratzenhofer, who outstripped his teacher in many reactionary aspects and, like Gobineau, viewed the Negroes for instance as born slaves, had to concede the lack of scientific substantiation in this respect. Racial dispositions are, indubitably, an authoritative basis for social behavior, but only in the rarest cases is it possible to prove the same for single individuals. Gumplowitz and his school rejected, however, the economic basis of the class struggle. Consequently, an observation of the problems of racial determining factors was bound to lead to a sorry and muddled eclecticism, and the development of imperialist reactionary ideology, after having been fertilized by the stimuli of social Darwinism, simply passed. This by illustrative of the transitional nature of the figure of Gumplowitz in racial theory is a conversation with a younger advocate of social Darwinism, Woltmann, which Gumplowitz published in a later edition of The Racial Struggle. Woltmann accused him of deviating from the correct path he had taken in his first book and of adulterating the correct racial concept. Gumplowitz defended himself thus, 141. In my home region I was already struck by the circumstance that the individual social classes represented quite heterogeneous races. There was the Polish nobility, which rightly always considered itself of different stock from the farmer. There was the German middle class, and beside it the Jews. So many classes, so many races. But my subsequent experience and knowledge, coupled with mature reflection, taught me that in the Western European countries, the individual classes of society had already long ceased to represent anthropological races, and yet they behave to each other like races and carry on a social racial struggle. In my racial struggle, the anthropological concept of race has been renounced, but the racial struggle has remained the same, although the races have not been anthropological ones for a very long time. But it is the struggle that counts. It provides an explanation for all phenomena in the state, the genesis of justice and state development. 42 It is typical that here Gumplowitz, objectively considered, completely abandoned the social theory of race in essence while preserving it unaltered in his terminology, and in his case that means, in its crucial philosophical consequences. Woltmann represents a higher stage of the transition to the reactionary development of biologism. His specific position rested on the fact that as an erstwhile social democrat, he was a revisionist seeking to link Marx with Darwin and Kant. He was able to make important advances in accommodating racial theory to imperialist needs. He extended Gumplowitz's idea that class struggles are essentially racial struggles, purged it of Gumplowitz's scruples and illogicalities, and consequently adopted, in updated form, certain lines of Gobineau's thinking, as also elements of French racial theory, which had advanced in the meantime. Lepage, etc. Woltmann retained from his social democrat past the terminology of social development and social structuring, but he changed all these categories into ones of biological racial theory. Thus surplus value, for instance, he treated as a biological concept. The social division of labor is founded upon the natural 145 inequality of physical and spiritual attributes. The 144 class antitheses were latent racial antitheses. This basis he so varied the revisionist glorification of capitalism as to imply that the latter constituted the best social order for natural selection. It goes without saying that Woltmann became an ideological defender of colonial oppression as well. In his opinion, it was hopeless undertaking to make Negroes and Indians capable of genuine civilization. In the colonies, the 145 whites would always form the master race only. And on the basis of social Darwinism he revived Gobineau's doctrine, but already as the ideology of German imperialism, by stating, the Nordic race is the born carrier of global civilization. 146. Thus behind the facade of a social doctrine, Woltmann represented the radical reactionary, imperialist theory of race with all its consequences, and that applies to the entire methodology. Let us recall the aforestated comments on equality. Like Lukacs, he repudiated the unitarian development of mankind. It was wrong, he claimed, to speak of an evolution of the human race. What evolve are 147 the individual races. Of course, Woltmann too saw that there are no pure races, in historical reality, and that all psychological distinguishing marks applied to race are highly dubious. But unlike Lukacs, he did not honestly admit this contradiction. Instead, he tried to evade it through demagogic convolutions. Thus he introduced with one eye to surmounting Goebbels the concept of racial demiscegenation, an idea of later significance for Hitler and Rosenberg. His stress on the importance of artificial racial breeding, originating in a mixture of crossbreeding and incest, gave rise to a markedly optimistic perspective contrasting with that of Goebbels. But in spite of all his impressive sociological and biological terminology, Woltmann did not manage to be any less arbitrary than Goebbels. At times he treated miscegenation as absolutely harmful and corrupting, at others he thought that the most important elements of breeding derived precisely from crossbreeding. His surmounting of Goebbels' pessimism rested upon the fatalism, modest hope of sustaining and protecting the sound and noble condition of the present generation through 148 measures of racial hygiene and racial policy. We shall see in due course what a barbaric, despotic system Hitlerism created from this modest hope. Woltmann too attained to no decisive influence. That was not because he was scientifically better or worse than earlier or later racial theorists, but because there was not yet a politico-social basis for the wider influence of applied racial theory in Germany at the time. The particular brand of racial theory that Woltmann represented confirmed this lack of effect. French racial theorists, e.g., the aforementioned Lukacs, could only daydream of Aryan mastery and outlined exceeding Goebbels in their pessimism horrific prospects of a Russian predominance in Europe, or of a European coalition under Jewish leadership, etc. 49 such German theorists as Otto Amann, meanwhile, could only grip the most extreme pan-Germans with a crude and patently unscientific propaganda of German predominance. Woltmann, on the other hand, condemned himself to ineffectiveness among reactionary circles through decided tendencies whereby he tried to achieve compromises between racial theory and his past revisionism. Like all reactionaries, he combated the idea of human equality and democracy. But he did not, for example, join in condemning the French Revolution as a slave uprising. An inferior race's revolt against the aristocracy, the Aryans, Franks. Nor did he share the view of the whole labor movement as a revolt of racial inferiors. He wrote of the French Revolution, the revolution's leaders were almost entirely Germanic, merely raised to power a different stratum of the Germanic race. It would be a mistake to believe that the revolution, the Third Estate, came to power in France. Power was gained only by the bourgeoisie, that is, the upper Germanic stratum of the middle class, just as the present labor movement, viewed anthropologically, reflects only the effective rise to power and liberty of the upper Germanic strata of the working class, compound of a revisionist substantiation of the rise of the labor aristocracy and a racialist glorification of the Germanic spirit. Could not possibly gain wide currency in German reactionary circles at that time. No reactionary German could welcome the interpretation of the French Revolution as a heroic deed of the Germanic spirit, to say nothing of the Germanic labor movement. Such fluctuations and inconsistencies made Woltmann's racial theory a transitory episode, although not a few of his ideas retained their influence into the fascist period. 4.